cabinet is the one that runs the country. And I will be talking more about this week check later on. So, in contrast, you could say that the executive in Singapore exercises a very strong check on the legislature and the judiciary because the cabinet essentially controls parliament. And what is of course also useful to know is that the judiciary does not overlap at all with the political branches, the executive and the legislature. So this is important because the judiciary can then act as an independent check on the political branches if they do something that's unconstitutional and so on, at least in theory. Okay, so now we get to the composition of Parliament. So I think you also know, and I don't think this is a mystery to you guys, Parliament is made up of 3 types of members of Parliament, and this is, I suppose, quite unique because not a lot of countries have this. So we have elected MPs, and elected MPs can either be elected through single-member constituencies, or SMCs, and group representation constituencies, or GRCs. And GRCs, of course, have between 3 to 6 MPs, and at least one of these MPs must be from a minority community in Singapore. And all this is actually fixed beforehand by the Prime Minister, and it can change from time to time, depending on which election we are talking about. So it's not sort of like, Holland Bukit will always be a GRC. It may change depending on which election you are at. And of course, they may decide that we're going to change the number of people in the GRC from 5 to 3 or something like that. And similarly, it is not that in a GRC, all you need is one minority member regardless of ethnicity. The ethnicity is also fixed before each election. So it will be declared that XYZ GRC will have a Malay member, or or ABC GRC will have an Indian or other minority member. So even it's fixed to that level as well. Okay? Then of course we have non-constituency MPs. Non-constituency NC MPs are the so-called best losers at the general election. And the formula is that there will be at least 9 of them, but you then subtract from 9 the number of opposition MPs that are actually elected. So for example, at the 2011 election, the last one we had, there were 6 opposition MPs actually elected at the election. So therefore the number of NC MPs that we have will be 9 minus 6 will be 3. So 3 were appointed, right? Yi Jianzhong, Gerald Giam, and Lina Chua. Lina Chiang, sorry. Excuse me. Okay. And then finally we have non-constituency. So more about NCMPs. NCMPs have to hold at least 15% of the votes in a constituency to be even considered. You get 10%, sorry, you're not entitled to be an NCMP. Then the seats are allocated in order of the vote percentage received. So if you get the highest returns after the PAP or whatever it is, then you would be first in line to be offered the NCMP seat, and so on and so forth. Somewhere else. And of course there are limitations on what NCMPs can do in Parliament. They are not allowed to vote on 4 categories of laws: constitutional amendments, money matters, a motion of no confidence in the government, and the removal of the president from his office. However, they can participate in the debates, so they are allowed to speak on any of these issues. It's just that when it comes to voting at the end of the day, then they will not be allowed to vote under the constitution. And of course, finally, we have non-constituency MPs. Okay, so one more thing about NCMPs, which is that actually you don't have to take the post if you are offered it, if you are an opposition MP. You can decline. And in the past, we have had certain opposition MPs who said, even if I'm offered, I will not take it. Okay, so that is permissible. But of course, what is interesting is that if you do take up an NCMP post, it does give you that visibility as an opposition MP, which you might not necessarily get if you weren't an NCMP. So we all know the names of the NCMPs that were in the last parliament much better, I would think, than other opposition party members who unfortunately did not get seats. Because they speak up in parliament, they have that visibility. So there is some advantage to, I suppose, taking up an NCMP seat. So finally, you've got NMPs, nominated MPs in parliament. They are chosen by a special select committee of parliament and appointed by the president. So again, the president has no personal discretion in this matter. He has to follow the instructions of the select committee here. And NMPs are supposed to represent independent and non-partisan views, but actually they are not required by law to resign from any political parties that they are members of.
there's no requirement for them to do so as long as they represent independent views and so on. And of course, they are subject to the same restrictions on voting in Parliament that apply to NCMPs as well. So what are the functions of the legislature? You can, I guess, break them down into three main ones. The legislature enacts laws. It controls the use of the nation's finances because it has to approve the government's budget every year, and this happens around the February-March period where there are budget debates in Parliament. And it also is supposed to ensure that the government is accountable for how it governs the nation. So the legislature also acts as a check on the judiciary. The judiciary, the courts make rulings, but sometimes the government may think, I'm not so sure about the effect of this ruling, I don't think it's a good idea. It can override the effect of the ruling by passing laws, and sometimes this is done. For ordinary laws, for ordinary judgments relating to non-constitutional matters, you just have to pass an ordinary law by Parliament and you can override the effect of that ruling by the court. But of course, if the ruling in question is a constitutional ruling, then you would actually have to amend the Constitution in order to override this. And it's slightly more difficult to amend the Constitution. The normal percentage you would need is at least a majority of MPs in Parliament. And as we know, the PAP has over 90% of the seats in Parliament, so it's very easy to achieve a simple majority. It is also actually not that difficult for them currently to amend the Constitution because all you need is 2/3, 66.6%, to amend the Constitution.
Do you want to max then?
No, it's okay. Yeah, it's fine. So actually in Singapore it's not that difficult to even amend the Constitution, and this was actually done back in the end of the 1980s. If you remember, following the ISA cases, the Marxist conspiracy cases, the Court of Appeal, which is the highest court in Singapore, gave a ruling about how the Internal Security Act should be interpreted, which basically said that the court is in a position to review whether or not a detention is lawful or not. And the government at the time felt that this was undesirable and therefore reversed it by way of amendments to the ISA as well as amendments to the Constitution. So this is how they would have to overturn a decision of the court. The legislature theoretically also acts as a check on the executive. And how does it do that? Well, MPs, and here I probably mean backbench MPs of the ruling party as well as opposition MPs, of course, and NCMPs and NMPs, have the right to ask ministers questions in Parliament. And we know that this happens whenever Parliament meets. You will often see in the newspapers that so-and-so minister has listed this bunch of questions to a minister to be answered. Okay? So they have the right under the rules to do so. And ministers are obliged to answer because this is their accountability, right? People have a right to know what the government is doing about this and what its policies are on a certain matter. But of course, that doesn't mean that they can fudge by just giving a very vague answer. And I've seen some really, really vague ones where basically it's a non-answer, but they have to say something. They can't say, I refuse to answer or I decline to answer. They have to give an answer, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a very informative answer. Most of the time it is, because a lot of these questions relate to key issues of the day, so the people want to know, and it's an opportunity for the government to explain its position. And of course, this also happens during budget debates. And this is the funny thing about budget debates in Singapore. Budget debates are never about actually how much money you spend. Because we know that the government will use its 91% majority in government to pass the budget. It's going to pass. So budget debates are really an opportunity to question government's policies on matters. And how this is done is that MPs propose a cut to the budget. And the cut is traditionally $100, which of course is nothing, right? The budget is millions and millions of dollars. Cutting $100 is meaningless. But it's actually just a way in which the chap gets to stand out and say, now I want to ask a whole bunch of questions about government policy on a particular matter. And then what happens is that the minister will then respond to all the questions that are posed by the minister. And then at the end of it, the minister will say, I withdraw my cut. So the budget is never actually cut. It's just a technique for being able to ask questions, more questions, and ensure accountability. Okay? And of course, as I have already alluded to just now, this is a very weak check because you're basically asking questions and getting responses. It's not blocking policy in any way. The PAP has, as I've said already, a very large majority in Parliament. Plus, we have what is called the party whip system. So the party whip system is an internal party thing. It's not a legal or constitutional thing. It just means that the party controls its discipline very carefully. It will tell its MPs what to do and what not to do. And most of the time, the party whip will say, the government is going to pass this piece of legislation. You must vote for it. You can't sort of have an individual MP say, today I don't feel like voting for this piece of legislation, so I'm going to vote no. Not allowed to, unless you want to risk sanctions from the party, right? You could be suspended. In a serious case, they could kick you out of the party, in which case you lose your seat. So therefore, because of this very strong party whip system, the PAP is able to push through its policies very easily by passing laws and so on. It's very straightforward. You don't get the situation in, for example, in the UK, where sometimes you get MPs who rebel against the party and will vote no even though they were told to vote yes. There is maybe less consequence in the UK Parliament because if MPs of a particular party are disenchanted enough, they can sometimes cross the floor. I'm going to resign from your party and join another party without losing my parliamentary seat. And then basically the power then shifts to the other party. This can't happen in Singapore because the constitution actually says if you resign from the party at which you were elected at the last election, you lose your seat. So it triggers at least a by-election. And it even may not, because if it's a GRC, no by-election needs to be held unless all the MPs disappear. Right? So it means that there's much less opportunity for MPs to basically leave their party and cross over to the other side and so on. So essentially, cabinet directs the legislative agenda. It will decide what laws will be passed. But at the very most, the ability of MPs to ask questions has a signaling effect. It sends a signal to the public to say, these are important issues and we want answers from the government on them. So I don't think we should say that the ability to ask questions is useless, right? It is a useful thing to have at the very least, even if you can't block the policy. Then I'm going to talk about how a government is formed. So Singapore uses the first past the post system. And of course what this means is that in a particular constituency, the candidate, if it's an SMC, or a team of candidates, if it's a GRC, which has the highest number of votes, will win. And this is the case even if it's not even 50% of the votes in that constituency. So let's take a simple example. Candidate A got 40% of the valid votes. Of course, we reject all the spot votes. Let's say there were 10% spot votes. Candidate B got 30% of the votes. Candidate C got 20% of the votes. The winner is candidate A, even though not even half of the constituents in the constituency voted for candidate A. As long as you are the majority, you will win the election there. Okay? Or the representative democracy. You, as the electorate, members of the electorate, vote for MPs to make decisions on your behalf, on how the government, how the country should be governed. And you can contrast this with the idea of direct democracy, where you would have a direct say as to whether policy A is adopted or not adopted through voting at a referendum. And this happens in some countries, like for example in Switzerland, and this is not like every single issue, but on some issues, there is direct democracy in some situations. So for example, I found out that if you manage to gather at least 100,000 signatures within an 18-month period on a particular proposal, then the government is obliged to allow you to discuss whether or not to amend the constitution. We don't have this procedure in Singapore, but it shows that you have a direct say about whether something should be done or not done. But we don't have that system in Singapore. Ours is one of representative democracy. So for representative democracy to function properly, we as citizens have to choose our MPs wisely, of course, because they are the ones who are supposed to govern on our behalf. We don't have a direct say in this. But I would say that representative democracy should be seen as something more than just dropping a ballot paper into a box every 4 or 5 years. It's not like, okay, my participation in representative democracy is I go to the polls and then in between nothing happens, it's the government that runs the show. We should see representative democracy, I think, as encouraging all citizens to be interested in how the country is governed in between general elections as well, advocating for positive changes by writing to MP, working with civil society groups, writing to the media, discussing matters with your family and friends. So there are many ways in which you can engage in democracy even in between elections. So in conclusion, the legislature as a whole exists to fulfill important constitutional principles. It is a means by which you exercise representative democracy. And of course, there's the concept of separation of powers, which is having the concept of checks and balances between the different branches of government to make sure that they act in a lawful way. But we want to consider perhaps whether or not the existence of legislature is a strong or weak check. It is a fairly weak check in Singapore. Then the composition of parliament, as you know, made up of elected MPs, NCMPs, and NMPs, also helps to promote this idea of representative democracy and separation of powers. But is having all these schemes like NCMP and NMP and GRCs actually useful, or does it tend to detract from the main issues of having representative democracy? So something to think about perhaps. Just want to say a little bit about judiciary, which this presentation is not really much about, but the judiciary is independent again of the two political branches, the executive and the legislature, and therefore can play an important role in checking them by exercising judicial review to ensure that laws and policies are constitutional and to ensure that acts and decisions comply with administrative law rules. And finally, representative democracy works best if citizens choose good leaders and of course play an active role in shaping laws and policies in between elections. Thank you very much, and I'm going to now hand you over to Kristen. A system where the winner takes all in the constituency. Therefore, the overall vote share of a political party does not reflect the number of political seats. Does not reflect the percentage of seats the party will actually get in parliament. So at the 2011 general election, it was reported that the PAP got 60.14% of the ballot votes cast. This is the lowest that they've got since independence. And yet, even though only 60.14% of the electorate voted in favor of the PAP, they won 81 out of 87 of the parliamentary seats, which is 93.1%. So there's no correlation between the actual number of people who support you by voting for you and the number of seats you will get because of the way in which the system works. So the first past the post system basically tends to favor large political parties who can field a lot of candidates at the very line to win. So basically in Singapore since 1965, all governments have been majority governments. And what this means is that, so how it works is like this. Under the Constitution, the President will appoint as the PM after the election an MP who, in his judgment, is likely to command the confidence of the majority of the members of Parliament. And of course, once the PM has been appointed, then the President will listen to the PM and appoint all the other cabinet ministers as well on the advice of the PM. If a political party has more than 50% of the seats, clearly it's going to always command the confidence of the majority because they've got a majority of seats in parliament. Plus, if you combine that with the strict party whip system, they are not going to say, no, I have no confidence in the PM. So they will definitely be able to form a majority government. However, and this has not happened in Singapore yet, it has happened, of course, in other countries. If a party has fewer than 50% of the seats, then what happens? Normally it would be one of these scenarios. It could try and form a coalition government or an informal alliance with other parties. So let's say the party has unfortunately only got 40% of the seats. What does it do? It then starts talking to smaller parties and says, hey, why don't we pack up together, right? We will combine together and then we'll have 51%. So therefore we'll vote together as a bloc, and therefore they can then form a coalition government in that way. Sometimes it doesn't work out, right? Sometimes all the other parties, the positions are all very far apart. And so the largest block the party with the largest block of seats will then sometimes say, okay, I'm going to try and form a minority government. So it means they will just go with how many seats they have and see how that works. The problem, of course, is that coalition and minority governments are less stable than majority governments. You need to compromise, right? You will probably only be able to convince smaller parties to join your coalition if you give and take, right? They'll say, look, I'm only going to join your coalition if you vote with me on environmental issue that I am very strongly on, or you do certain things. So even though that's not your party's priority, you might have to say yes in order to get them on board, right? So there's a bit of give and take there. And of course, the problem is that if there's a disagreement between the coalition, it could break down. And then once you break down, your total number of seats then drops below the 50% one. You are vulnerable to a vote of no confidence. And once you have a vote of no confidence, the parliament may get dissolved, you have to have another election, and so on. Okay, so this means that a coalition government is vulnerable to these votes of no confidence, and similarly, a minority government, by its very definition, will be vulnerable to a vote of no confidence because it has to be 50% at least, right? Okay. So an alternative method to first past the post is what is called proportional representation. So proportional representation tries to ensure that the composition of parliament actually reflects the vote share that the parties actually got in the election. In other words, let's say if a party got 35% of the votes in the election, then it should get about 35% of the seats in parliament. It tries to ensure this correlation. I'm not going to go through the methods for achieving this. They are extremely complex. But one common method is called the single transferable vote system. And even this, you have to consider a little bit because it could be a bit tricky, right? So I'm not going to go into the mathematics of how it works because it's going to be very complicated and I'm not a mathematician. So instead of voting for a single candidate, what you would actually do is your ballot paper would allow you to rank candidates, right? So you could actually say, I would like to put candidate A as my first choice, candidate C as my second choice, candidate B as my third choice. It's up to you. You can only put one choice if you like. I only want to vote for candidate A, that's fine. That's fine with you, okay? It's up to you to decide how many you want to rank. And then there is a special formula, which I won't describe now, which determines the quota of votes that any candidate needs to win. So it's fixed at a certain amount based on the formula. Then after that, when they open out all the ballot papers, they will look and see, has any candidate actually reached or exceeded that quota? If so, that candidate is deemed elected. But here's where the tricky part comes in. If the candidate has more votes than is necessary to reach the quota, he's got excess, then the excess number of votes is then transferred to the next person, next preference in the list. And then you will repeat the process. If then you look at the number of votes after the transfer, oh, has that person reached the quota? Oh, that person is also elected. So you slowly fill the seats by transferring the excess votes and pushing them all in. On the other hand, if no candidate meets the quota, the candidate with the least number of votes drops out. And then you transfer that person's vote to the persons who are higher up in the ranking. And you keep doing this process by either pushing people up into the thing and then transferring the excess votes, or dropping out the last person with the least number of votes and then transferring the votes to the other people until all the seats are filled. And that is supposed to somehow give you a result that is more representative of the actual share in which you get in the parliamentary election itself. And I'm not going to explain why because I have no idea, but apparently this system does give you that result, okay? But you can see that it's a much more complicated method. It's not just, let's count and see who has the majority. You have to do all this special thing. Maybe they've used a computer to work it out and so on, okay? So the difference between the current system they have, which is first past the post, and proportional representation, is that you can see that proportional representation is going to favor small parties, right? Because if, let's say, 60% vote for PAP, 40% vote for WP, and then 10% vote for Z, then all of them are going to get seats in parliament. And so you could get a very fractured parliament, and it makes coalition governments, minority governments, much more likely to happen. And I was told that in some countries, I don't know whether it was New Zealand or some other country, when they switched to this system, immediately from then on, they never had a majority government anymore. It was all minority governments or coalition governments because of the way in which the vote is very fractured. People vote for different parties. Okay? PAP has said it does not favor the system because it, of course, doesn't favor big parties and so on, right? And of course, it's too complicated, no minority government, unstable, so it has said we don't intend to shift to that system. But anyway, just let you know that there is this alternative system. Okay, so finally I'm going to talk about the meaning of what representative democracy is. So democracy, was of course a Greek word, comes from the rule of the people, right? And the Venerable Oxford English Dictionary defines it as government by the people, the form of government in which the sovereign power resides in the people and is exercised either directly by them, which is not the case in Singapore, or by officers elected by them. Okay? So we can compare democracy with other systems of government, such as autocracy, which is government by like a single powerful person, theocracy, government by a religious group, aristocracy, government by an elite, a class of people, and hereditary monarchy, which is of course government by a king or queen or something like that. Okay, so you could say that democracy is supposed to be more consistent with the idea that people are of equal dignity and have equal rights. Right? If you have a system of autocracy, then of course the person at the top is supposed to be much more important than you, but that goes against the idea of equality and so on. And of course, democracy is also said to promote the idea that, well, you know, we can get the best government by choosing people from all sectors of society rather than just a very small sector like those people who have a royal title. Right? So you're able to garner the best talent by allowing anyone who's talented to contest the election. And there are, of course, other ideas that promote democracy. John Locke, the philosopher, said that, well, since people are by nature free, equal, and independent, nobody can be subject to the political power without consent. So you need to consent to your leaders being elected before they can exercise power over you. There's a utilitarian argument, which is that it's good to have the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, and the argument is that people will be the happiest if they have the freedom to make choices to further their own interests, which you can do through voting. And of course, democracy is a safeguard against the abuse of power. If the government abuses the power, we revoke that power by voting them out and voting in a new set of people. There are interests that are promoted by democracy. Legitimacy. Legitimate rule is much more effective than illegitimate rule, because illegitimate rule, you'll have to rule by the sword. If you don't follow me, you will die in my gulag, you know, or my prison. It's very difficult to rule that way. So it's much easier to say, oh, the people love me, I have their support, which explains why even illiberal regimes such as North Korea would have an election, even if it's a rigged election, to show, oh, you know, I got so much support. Right? Why do you bother? I mean, you got the power, do you even need to have an election? But they will still hold it to show legitimacy. So democracy promotes legitimacy. Democracy promotes concern for the nation. John Stuart Mill, another philosopher, said, let a person have nothing to do for his country, he will not care for the country. So by giving people the chance to vote, hopefully people will have will care for the country, will care for what happens, and then there will be a better society for all. And finally, it promotes the idea of contribution to the nation, right? Those of us who are working, a lot of us will be required to pay tax. Is it fair to impose this requirement for people to pay tax if they have no choice about who is running the country? So again, it ties in this idea of no taxation without representation. But of course, democracy can be subverted and there are shortcomings. You could say that democracy is a very inefficient process, right? Every 5 years or 4 years or so, we have to have an election. And elections cost money, right? It costs actually millions of dollars to run an election. It's much more, you can say it's cheaper in a sense, right? To have a totalitarian leader who never changes, and never have that election. You save a couple $1 million every 5 years. Oh, well, that's good, right? So that's one way of looking at it. And if there is no dominant political party in an election, there's lots of small parties, then there could be instability, as we have said later on, minority governments and so on, and this will create a rather unstable situation. And of course, democracy can be subverted in various ways. You can have no real choice. Here are the candidates. There's only one person to vote for. You must vote for this person. Is that a real election? Right? There can be unreasonable qualifications for candidates. You can coerce voters, you can bribe voters. These are ways in which you can subvert democracy. There can be an insufficient basis on which choices are to be made if the media is not free. People are not properly informed of issues. And of course, there's gerrymandering, which is neutralizing hostile wards, hostile constituencies, by subsuming them under favorable larger constituencies. So this is a common complaint of opposition parties, that the electoral boundaries are changed, and this tends to favor the incumbent. However, it has been said by no less than Winston Churchill that no one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, apart from all the other governments that have been tried from time to time. So it's kind of like the best of the worst, if you like to put it this way, according to Winston Churchill. Democracy is not mentioned expressly in the Singapore Constitution, but I think we can regard this as a basic constitutional principle. There was a lot of publicity given to the proclamation of Singapore this year because it's our 50th anniversary. And in that proclamation, which was made on 9th August of 1965, the then PM Lee Kuan Yew said that on behalf of the people and government of Singapore, as from that date, Singapore shall forever be a sovereign, democratic and independent nation. So this is the only reference to democracy in a constitutional document in Singapore. But even though the word itself doesn't appear in the Constitution, I think it can be inferred from it, because the Constitution requires regular elections, and that of course presupposes a concept of democracy.
Where, as Jack said, that the system is very similar but also had huge differences. So putting aside the fact that UK is a way bigger country than Singapore, so then the issues kind of change, because they have basically, like, Northern Ireland has its issues, Scotland had its issues, Wales and England had their issues. So even if you put that apart and understand that then Singapore's elections are actually a lot smaller in focus, there wasn't that town council sort of focus in the UK, precisely because members of parliament in the UK are not town councillors. Councillors are actually separately elected in the UK, so you can have your Labour MP and your Labour councillor, or you could even have a Tory MP and a Labour councillor in the same place. So one guy takes care of your constituency matters, like who picks up the bins every Thursday, and the other guy goes into Westminster and actually debates policies, and they have very, very fierce debates there. So in Singapore, the whole change that brought town councils into parliamentary elections and into the politics, because in the 1980s they introduced this system where MPs would then also be town council managers, basically. And that's how it all came in. Like, in the last I haven't seen it yet in this election, but in the last election I've been to rallies where election promises were actually, you will get to choose the colour of your HDB block. Or wouldn't it be fun if I was elected, I will organise the community centre trip to Universal Studios? And these were like MPs were running for elections at rallies and promising these things as election promises. And it was kind of like, I can buy my own ticket to Universal Studios. I don't need you to do that. I need you to go into Parliament and fight about things like minimum wage and population policies and immigration policies and transport policies. And so I personally feel that having this whole town council matter kind of mixed in does sometimes dilute the focus of what parliamentary elections are for, which is to, make laws or amend laws, and that determine the direction of policies. And just another personal kind of observation, recently I was very stuck on this point. As a young Singaporean who doesn't own an HDB flat, I really don't care about the municipal issues so much. It doesn't affect me whether the rain cover is 100 meters long or 150 meters long. And I do care about transport and population and housing, but I also feel that there are a lot of Singaporeans who are now looking further than that. They also want to know about equality and discrimination. We've got LGBT voters who for many, many years have been told that you are not a priority issue. Once we solve all the issues that affect all the voters, then we will talk about gay rights. Because gay people are not voters, I don't understand this. But they're always like, oh, we will solve the bread and butter issues first, then we will solve the gay rights, because problems like housing and population can be solved once and for all. This is another red herring that I've been told by candidates across all parties. So I feel that if, as a young Singaporean whose main concern is more social justice and human rights causes, I am largely unrepresented. Not just in Parliament, but in elections and politics. Because so the last elections I did this, and the current elections I'm doing this, going up to various candidates and saying, well, what do you feel about migrant workers? What do you feel about gay rights? What do you feel about foreign policy? The last elections, I actually went up to a candidate who was a businessman who had business in Burma. I said, well, I don't like how Singapore deals with the Burmese junta. Can you tell me about that? And he said, can you ask me about the town council matters first? And I said, well, I don't care about that. And he goes, okay, bye. And then he just walked off. So I feel like, what can we do to bring these kind of causes to the fore, to encourage more Singaporeans to talk about it? Because if Singaporeans talk about it, then at some point the political parties have to pick up on that as well, because they want to feel like they're connected to the people. So these are just some things that we could probably discuss in the Q&A.
Do we have an extra mic? No, we have just
one more.
okay.
20 seconds.
20 seconds.
You could use this one and share that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the question that I was stuck on was if I wanted to vote opposition to ensure diverse parliament, but my opposition candidate was a homophobe, then what do I do? You hold your nose and vote him anyway for the sake of, more representation, or do you go with your beliefs and then I don't know what, like, I mean, because what if the PAP guy is also a homophobe? Then I stuck, right?
Yes. I don't know whether it's ever I don't know whether it's ever that clear, right? But I know that even the main opposition party at the moment, which is WP, refuses to take a position on this issue, right? They'll say, well, we don't want to, we can't reach agreement on this with our Central Executive Committee, so we don't have a position on this issue.
I thought of picking up on that theme. And if you have any questions in the meantime, just raise your hand and we'll pass the mic down to you. But I'd like to pick up on this theme from Kirsten's points about minority protection. Because democracy always results in the majority, or often results in the majority getting their ways. So if I could just ask Professor Jack Lee to tell us a bit more about what minorities can do to insulate themselves from the political winds, or what can be done in between elections to make sure that the government fulfills its promises as well.
I think you've hit the nail on the head when you said that the democratic process doesn't tend to help minorities because they are a minority, right? How our system works is that the majority will get their vote and will get the candidate in. So it is probably right to say that the candidate who gets elected will be representative and will feel obliged to represent the views of the majority who manage to support him or her and get him or her into parliament. In other systems, how minority rights would be protected would be partially through the courts, because the courts are required to protect people's human rights. The idea of human rights is that every person has got certain rights which are so central and so dear that not even a majority in parliament can vote to take them away. However, in Singapore, it doesn't work so well because the courts over the years, and I've done looked at this over a 50-year period since independence, the courts have not been very keen about upholding individual rights, and they have a tendency to give the government the benefit of the doubt and say, well, if the government passed this law, they must have a good reason for doing so, and we don't really see it as our role to go against the government policy on the matter because we are not the government. And so therefore you end up with very, very few cases where the courts have actually upheld some kind of right. There have only ever been 3 cases out of 50 years where the courts found something to be either unconstitutional or didn't agree with the government's interpretation of the Constitution. The first case was the Marxist conspiracy case, and that was overturned by the government because they said, oh, we don't like this decision of the court, and so they actually reversed it by way of a constitutional amendment and amendment to the ISA. The second case, the High Court actually in the 1998 held that a particular provision of the Prevention of Corruption Act was unconstitutional, it was a violation of the right to equality. This was overturned on appeal to the Court of Appeal, so in the end negated. The last decision, which is actually still in force, is the Velleman decision. So it was a very rare case where the court actually said, we disagree with the Prime Minister's interpretation of the Constitution. We find that there is an obligation to hold a by-election when it arises in an SMC. So I was like, oh wow, it's like the first time I actually stuck, But it's quite surprising that, after all these years, there's been so few cases where the courts actually gave decisions that upheld rights. So it would appear that that's not a very effective method in Singapore. So I don't know. I suppose what minorities would have to do is to continue to encourage the government to seek policies that would be in their interest, perhaps on a broader basis of saying, well, isn't it better to have laws that prevent discrimination rather than to leave it to employers to do the right thing, and to keep sort of pushing them to promote policies of this sort. I suppose that's what they can do. maybe Kirsten has some thoughts on this as well.
Any questions? Don't have. You, never mind. Okay. In any case, there was a list of questions which came in through the registration forms. I thought we could explore some of them in the meantime.
Sorry, can I just ask, so you said there was, or you mentioned there was a separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary,
Yes.
but who appoints the judiciary? Isn't it the executive?
Yes. So we have a traditional appointment method, which is that cabinet essentially chooses the nominees for people who will be appointed to be judges, and they are approved by the president. So the president now does have a power to veto appointments if he feels that they are unsuitable. This veto can be overridden by a 2/3, I think, right? 2/3? 2/3 majority in parliament. Yeah. So there is a procedure for it, but of course, for the president to even say, I'm going to veto this, would be a big thing. It would send a message to people, say, hey, something strange is going on, and maybe highlight the issue, and then you can exercise your vote accordingly in the next election if you disagree with it and so on. But it does mean that we have a very traditional form of appointment of judges, and I think this leads to judges being appointed who share the ethos of the government, right? I mean, if you were the prime minister, why would you go out of your way to appoint a very activist judge who's likely to strike down your policies? You would pick people who believe in strong government, who believe that government should be given the benefit of the doubt. And I think this, to some extent, would translate into the judgments that we get from the court. So an alternative method would be for us to adopt what the UK has recently done, which is to have an independent judicial appointments panel. So instead of having this be a direct decision by the PM and the cabinet, instead you have a body called the Judicial Appointments Panel, which is staffed by various civil servants as well as people invited to be on the panel, and they are the ones who will vet through and put up nominations for appointment. So I suppose you could have that system. It is hard to get away from the politics entirely, because then the focus shifts to who is on the panel. How did they get there? You know what I mean? So there will always be a little bit of politics that gets into the process. But you could say that it is an attempt to make it a more independent process, I suppose. But I don't know whether there's any intention to change the system anytime soon. I don't see any discussion about it.
So can we say that the judiciary in Singapore is not entirely independent?
Do you want to use
Okay, that is a question I cannot answer, because if I did give an answer to it, this amounts to scandalizing the court, which is a criminal offense in Singapore. Yes, we do have a law on this. So we cannot make any assertion that insinuates that the courts in Singapore are not independent without any basis for it. So I'm not going to answer that question.
If they are selected by the executive.
Well, okay, my personal view is this, right? That I don't think that there is a secret red phone in the judge's room that rings when a case is being decided, and then the voice says, you must decide the case in this way. I don't think it works that way. But I think that because of the way in which judges are appointed, and the fact that there's no reason why the government would want to appoint a judge that they know is going to be an obstruction to them and who is likely to overturn their policies. So you get a system where the judges tend to believe in very strong government. And I think that then tends to translate into the judgment that we get. It's not so much a matter of, like direct phone calls or direct, you must decide the case in this way. I don't see any evidence for that, so I can't say that is what happens.
I guess to illustrate that point, you can take the United States as an example. Bush and Gore, Supreme Court of the United States awarded the election to a particular candidate, and they voted along what is commonly known as party lines, right? But nobody asserts that the Supreme Court got a call from George Bush to give the election to them or rule in such a way. But they voted that way because of... Oh, echo it.
What?
They voted that way because of political ideology, not so much of because someone told them to do so. And I think that's Professor Jack Lee's point. So, if I could just... If there are no questions in the meantime, there is? Okay, yes, let's go. LKY.
Hi, I'm a student at the LKY School of Public Policy, and in that vein, I was wondering whether you could share your thoughts, and maybe this uses some of the questions that you got through registration as well. Your thoughts about the next step in the policy process after the Parliament. So there's the civil service and public servants in general, and the elections department, of course, falls under that. I wanted to get your thoughts about how you perceive whether the civil service is insulated currently, and more normatively speaking, whether you think it should be more independent as a body as a whole, or maybe civil servants in particular.
If I can add to that also, I'm wondering about the implications of the election department here not being independent. What does that mean for elections?
The election department being under the PM's office, accusations of gerrymandering and unfair practice, whether it actually happens or not, it almost doesn't matter because people perceive it to be like that. It just reminded me when Jack said that the UK had introduced something, that this UK general election this year was also their first fixed term general election. So they actually in 2011 passed a law that says our elections are going to be fixed terms now. It's going to be like the first Thursday in May of every 5 years. The Prime Minister still has the prerogative to call a snap election if he feels like it's necessary, but otherwise it's going to be on this day in the next 5. So like this year it was May 7th, you can actually count and figure out which date it was. So everyone knows kind of roughly when the election, unless there's going to be some like exceptional circumstance and David Cameron decides I better call now because in 5 years it won't be so good. So everyone kind of knows when the election is, which does make it easier for all the parties, especially the smaller parties who don't have as much resources to make their plans.
The election boundaries and independence of the election boundaries.
I think there was a question about
independence of civil service.
The civil service, as in insulated, as in how would you mean insulated?
I'm just thinking sort of more generally speaking, maybe not just about elections, but also, MND, for instance, is involved in the management of town councils, and there are suggestions, I don't know whether they're true or not, that there's like politicization, problems about the minister saying certain things to civil servants that you need to like take care of certain alternate things, like these kinds of matters, I guess. What kinds of protections are available, say in the law, and I guess more normatively speaking, whether you think there should be protections or recourse for civil servants if they think that something's being too politicized and this is not their role, or even say involvement of civil servants in electioneering, whether you can say you have a policy announcement, you time it such that it's like right after the National Day rally, and civil servants are involved in production of that. So is that considered, electioneering? Is that out of the boundary of what a civil servant should be able to do?
I find it. Well, I've never been in the civil service, so I find it. I can't really say like what goes on behind the ministries, but I suppose it's a perception issue that people feel that the civil service is very tied in with particular political leanings. And the one that struck me was when they introduced Chee Hong Tat, who used to be the second permanent secretary. And so they introduced him one day after he left, like he officially resigned. So he said, I officially resigned on Thursday being my last day of office, and then Friday he was introduced. Technically that would mean that Friday was the first day that he could legally be a member of a political party, but he already has this video of him in the PAP shirt and introducing the candidate video. When did he shoot that? Did he shoot that on Thursday night after he left office? So I feel like these things make people feel like something that something is not quite fair.
Yeah, I suppose that this is not surprising because the PAP has been the incumbent government since 1959, and so there is probably a lot of there's probably a lot of sense that the civil service works closely with the PAP government. I suppose, in theory, they are supposed to be independent because they are supposed to be able to work with any new government that comes in, and I suppose they should be reminded of that fact. Similarly, I don't know of any actual incidents where this has actually happened, but
the civil service should not, for example, be used for political party purposes, right? You're not supposed to use the machinery of the state for furthering party objectives. But of course, again, I don't have any particular instances of evidence that this has actually happened. But again, civil servants should be aware that they're not supposed to do this kind of thing as well. Yeah, whether or not they should be involved in politics, that's an interesting question. I mean, I know that in the UK it does happen, because I have a friend who was working for DEFRA, which is the Department of Agriculture and something else. I can't remember the name, it's a very long word. And yet she was actually permitted to run for local government elections and served as for a while as a councillor in her district in London. And I was actually very surprised by that. I was like, oh, you mean a politician can, a civil servant can actually run under the banner of a political party in a political post? And she said, yes, it's actually not seen as a very strange thing. I still have my duties at DEFRA, which of course I have to carry out, but I also have my constituency functions as a local government councillor.
Does it vary according to how high up you are in?
Yeah, I suppose it would be. I suppose because she was not that senior. Yeah, I suppose maybe there's some internal rule that says if you rise beyond a certain like administrative, what they call administrative service or something, you probably are not allowed to, because that would be too sensitive, I guess. Yeah.
But yeah, that reminded me that recently I was reading a book by Dr. Michael Barr, who wrote The Ruling Elite of Singapore, and in that book he actually traces the PAP government using using first president scholarships and a whole other range of public service commission scholarships, then the civil service and the military as a recruitment drive so like in his book, his theory, which he actually managed to trace using a few examples, was that first you get the president's scholarship, then you go overseas to study, you come back, you serve your bond, you do very well in civil service, you rise up to be someone's permanent secretary, and then suddenly one day you quit civil service and become PAPMP. And so that was how he traced it. So I suppose that adds to the perception.
Can I just, before that question, can I just jump in to ask about the lady's question about elections and the independence? Recently, there was a whole controversy about the drawing of boundaries, and it's actually a controversy that happens every single election. So the question is, the elections department is directly under the Prime Minister. So I assume the Parliamentary Elections Act allows the minister in charge of that department to promulgate subsidiary legislation or regulations that administer the Act. What's to stop the Prime Minister from promulgating legislation, subsidiary legislation and regulations that favour his party over the other parties? And what's the status of that Electoral Boundary Review Commission? And again, what's to stop the Prime Minister from drawing the boundaries in his party's favour, since he is going to be a candidate in elections after all?
Right. So I would say the answer is nothing. He is entitled to do so. But this would not be without cost. I mean, if it was done that blatantly, I think, we are not fools, and people will be able to see through that. So it's never going to be that blatant, that would just be a political suicide, I think. Having said that, I mean, I do think there is much to be said for not having the elections department as a sub-department of the PMO. Even if it is just for the sake of showing that that there's a semblance of independence there, it should really be an independent commission that has people appointed independently. And I would think that the elections department should be the one that appoints the electoral boundaries, EBR review committee. Rather than it being directly appointed by the PM. The EBRC, as many of you will know, actually has no legal status. All the legislation in Singapore says is that the PM shall declare the boundaries. So actually, if he wanted to, he could say, I'm not going to appoint anyone, I'm just going to get my own staff to my secretary to go and draw it out, my principal secretary to draw it out, and I will declare it like that.
The secretary is in the committee.
Oh yes, so okay. Right, okay. So but my point is that there's actually no legal requirement for him to appoint any committee. It's just that it has been done as a matter of course since the 1950s, and they continue with that process to say, well, we will get the experts in the area, right? Someone from the department that does the statistics, so they know the population demographic changes and all that to work this out. But I think that, for the purpose of transparency and so on, it would make a lot of sense for the elections department to be spun out as an independent commission, and for them to do the appointment of all these committees to carry out boundary delimitation. And I think Kirsten pointed out in a very interesting article recently that in the past, tell us about that. Tell us about that. Yeah.
So after the EBRC report came out, I started to look through how the boundaries are drawn. And then I forced Jack to go through the Parliament Hansard for me. To dig up a lot of things. And we found that in 1957, when they were debating the City Council ordinance, so this wasn't about Legislative Assembly elections, it was City Council elections, the opposition then pushed for an amendment that said if you change the boundaries, you need to advertise it in the 4 main language newspapers once a week for 4 weeks. And then people get to write in to object or to propose different boundaries, or why you change my area, I want to go back to that area. And after that, the committee then has to take into account these suggestions and complaints and either make the changes or justify the changes, then the boundaries are set. And this is also and what started me on this was because my Malaysian friend told me that the Bersih committee, and Bersih is marching today, Bersih committee had sued the government in Sarawak for drawing the boundaries without advertising it. And that the court in Malaysia had actually said that Bersih was right and that they can't just change boundaries. So that started me wondering, if Malaysia is like that, why doesn't Singapore have this rule? So I went to find it, and I found out we did have this rule with the City Council, then we abolished the City Councils, and then we didn't have the rule again. And I think, and so since then the Parliamentary Elections Act has not stipulated any obligation to advertise boundaries.
And I think what was particularly interesting in what you found was that at the time the opposition was the PAP. And they were the ones who said, there must be a chance for us to object to the boundaries.
Lee Kuan Yew was like, we must let all parties speak so that it is transparent. That was Lee Kuan Yew.
But then when PAP then came to power subsequently, they decided, we don't want to have this system of local government and national government. Singapore is very small. Let's just abolish the city council and we'll just do it on national thing. And then they never stuck the provision back into the national elections provision. So,
there was a question there?
Yeah, it's not so much a question but a comment about what Professor Jack Lee has put up just now when he was saying how he feels that we cannot pinpoint a single incident where the civil service is actually politically affiliated. But I think more than what they do, we should also look at what they are not doing. For example, if we juxtapose Singapore's system with the UK system, from what I understand, in the UK they will have shadow cabinet, and before the calling of any general elections, for example, the main opposition parties will have access to the civil service, the permanent secretaries, and they'll sit down and talk through plans together to look at feasibility plans. And these things are not present in Singapore, so we cannot expect the opposition parties to have something more as nuanced as what the PAP have. So to say that our civil service is independent and apolitical to a certain extent is true, but there's also many more things that they can do to improve the viability of inviting more political participation in the country. Yeah.
I suppose we never had a situation where
even at the moment with the most opposition MPs we've ever had, I don't think we have enough to make a shadow.
But I mean, that being said, I don't know whether they've ever tried. Have they ever written to a government department and say, would you please, we need this information, would you please let us know? I do not know whether they ever tried to do that and what the response has been. But I think the main problem has been that the presence has been so small. I mean, this has been the first term of Parliament where they actually had more than 2 members at a time, it's maybe they haven't quite got their game in play yet, and it will be interesting to see what happens in the next election, whether they will have a bigger or smaller representation, I don't know.
Well, I don't know if the opposition parties have tried, but I'm sure, but I do know that civil society organizations have tried and have never got very much information out of anybody. Yeah.
There was a question in the list that we have that asked about what we can do in the meantime, in between elections, to ask for information in order to inform ourselves about government policies and things. Is there any, do they have any legal obligation to disclose information to us, Professor?
No. Strictly speaking, no. We don't have a Freedom of Information Act in Singapore, which some countries have, which puts an obligation on the government to disclose information upon request. So basically, we are left with whatever information the government departments choose to make public. I mean, there is there is stuff on websites there, but if they decide to cease putting the information, there's very little you can actually do. For example, I mean, and I think you would maybe know this better, information on the number of death penalty cases used to be made publicly available, then it became politically inexpedient to do so, and so the information was stopped, right? They stopped putting in reports and so on. And since then, I think it's been virtually impossible to find out like how many people are executed every year as a result of a death penalty and so on. And there's not very much you can do about that.
Well, stuff like that, they sometimes, or even when they do release, you do have issues with follow-up. So like, they release things like, say, 30 people on death row, and then they just release this number, and then you say, well, how many are men, how many are women, what ethnic groups do they come from, what economic backgrounds, what country, how many foreigners, how many Singaporeans, and then there's no breakdown of this, and you don't really know, is it because they don't have it, or they have it and they just don't want to share with you. So there have been issues, and I think academics have also said there's been issues with like the sort of different measures. So that, 1 year the population statistic includes construction workers from Bangladesh, the next year it doesn't include them anymore, and so it's very difficult to compare the data when they're like all split up like that.
There is one legal procedure that could be used, and of course I've mentioned this already, which is the MP's power to ask questions. So what I've noticed being happen is that sometimes people contact their MP and say, could you ask this question? You probably have to have a good relationship with the MP, and I don't know whether this happens in like PAP wards or not, whether the backbench MP would be willing to ask questions on behalf of civil society groups to find out information on this. What I've noticed happening is that people then go to NMPs who are neutral. And of course, NMPs are in Singapore are appointed to represent certain sectoral interests as well, right? There's normally an education, someone from the education sector, someone from arts and culture, someone from the labor movement, and so on and so forth. And so, what then civil society groups have done is to say, we'll go to the NMP who is supposed to be interested in this area, and we'll engage the NMP and say, can you ask these questions? And sometimes they are very obliging, right? And we've actually found out quite interesting information that way. I know Eugene Tan, for example, my colleague, when he was an NMP, did ask very interesting questions to elicit responses from ministers. But of course, there are ways to answer the question, to not give information. You can get a very vague answer that we are studying it and blah blah blah. So, but it's better than nothing. So that's one possible way of trying to extract information.
But the problem is, sorry, if we notice, like there's one asking of the work levy. For example, like asking for the work levy, how much is collected, right? When it was asked in Parliament, the breakdown was only given for 2011, 2012, and the question was asked in 2013. So it's like, why is it that there's no like before breakdown? So you can't see any trend. You can't really see where and what is the money used for. So they'll give really big figures that you have to exploit for them. Then when you do that, then they say, oh, you're exploiting for the figures. Of course, you give such a figure, of course I will do that.
Well, I mean, I don't know about that specific instance, but it depends on how you ask the question. So if you are clever, you will ask it in a very detailed way. You know what I mean? Don't just ask, what was the figure? You got to like ask for what was the figure for the years, this.
But then again, speaking to NCMP, right, the problem is, right, when you put the questions out, they will say that, oh, you can ask the question in this way.
Yes, that is true. There is a vetting process for all questions.
Yeah,
that's true.
So even if you draft the question so well and so decisive, they say that, oh no, sorry, you can ask the question.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay, yeah. I mean, I didn't know there were, because I would have thought that merely saying, I want to know it for a certain year, that's nothing objectionable, right? So I'm quite surprised that that kind of question got thrown out. The other thing, of course, that an MP or NCMP or NMP could do is to ask follow-up questions, which they are able to do. So let's say the minister says the figure was this, they could say, I want to seek a clarification in Parliament. So of course, it's for the MP involved to be smart enough to stand up and say, okay, I need to ask further questions to probe a bit more and see what response I get.
A German motion as well.
Yes. You want to say something about that?
No idea.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. So, yeah, so of course there are certain parliamentary procedures, right? Again, MPs can also use what is called the adjournment motion to raise questions. You are allowed to file a request to be able to raise a certain point for discussion in Parliament, and that has sometimes been done by backbench MPs, opposition MPs, and MPs, and so on. Another way, in fact, is to use the public petition, which hasn't been used a lot. So basically, if you gather enough signatures, you can actually put something on the parliamentary agenda for Parliament to discuss.
What's the number?
I can't remember. I will have to check the standing orders of Parliament, but
Okay.
I think there are some requirements of what you have to satisfy. Again, the question can be vetted, and they can say this is an inappropriate question and all that. But this was done, for example, to bring the Section 377A issue before Parliament for discussion. So that's, I guess, one of the more high-profile uses of a public petition procedure, which does exist.
I think I read somewhere that everything that's published or broadcast in Singapore has to, like 2 or 3 copies, I'm not sure the exact number, but 2 or 3 copies has to be deposited with the National Library. And then
it's actually required to go
5,
into
I think.
archives, right? It's
So,
by right.
I
Yes.
think you're right.
Okay,
Fine.
because that's two different issues,
Yeah.
right? For collection purposes, every document that is published in Singapore, 5 copies have to be given to National Library. But National Library is not under any obligation to keep it, right? Because some of it is just like,
Not to allow us to borrow it, of course.
no, because they have to decide whether they want to hold it in their collection. And sometimes they'll say, look, this is just like a diary and things like that. Do we want to have copies of all the diaries published by all the companies in Singapore? You know, so they will receive it and then they'll throw it away. But of course, if it's an important publication, they should not throw it away, I guess. So yes, so you would have copies of those things in the library normally. The archives is a separate thing. So under the National Archives Act, government departments are supposed to transfer closed documents that they are not using anymore to the archives for safekeeping. My understanding of the difficulty there is that the classification procedure is a little bit tricky. So what happens is that they just stamp secret on everything or restricted on everything, and they don't have a process of declassification. So then what happens is that the archives will say, well, we do have documents of this nature in our records, but you will have to go back to the government department and ask whether you have permission to review it. And then you have to see whether they will agree to it or not. And some researchers I hear have basically they've been told, no, this has to remain confidential, and we are not going to declassify it for you. Ideally, you should have a process that every, I don't know, after 30 years or 50 years, it should be declassified, and someone should review the documents for the purpose of this. This is very expensive and time-consuming. Someone has to sit down and look through the whole document and see, can I declassify it? And the much easier way is for them to just stamp everything confidential and give it to archives. Then they don't have to spend the time to do that. But of course, it's not very good if they do it that way.
So there's
Can I
nothing.
if you don't mind, are there any other questions around? Yes.
Hi, can I ask, what is the role and... Hi, my name is Sal. I would just like to find out what's the actual role and function of People's Association, and does it belong to the government, to PAP, or to the people? And what is its actual role in politics?
Sure, why don't we take the other question as well? There was a hand behind. We take it together.
Yes, there's going to be an upcoming discussion, I think it'll be on live broadcast with the PAP and spokespeople from 5 other political parties. And it seems to me like a step in the right direction for democracy, but there are comments from around the place that say that it's a half-hearted effort. So I just wanted to know from the panel, what are your thoughts on the issue?
Okay, the PA is a statutory board. So it is a statutory board under, I think, the Ministry of Community Development. MCCY, right? Yeah. Oh, so Culture, Community and Youth now called. So it is a government department. It is not sort of a like a private association and so on. And its function is to I suppose promote good community relations, blah blah blah, and it does carry out those kind of functions. But I suppose people always seem to forget that it is actually a government department, rather than it being sort of just a private association that's supposed to bring people together. And so it has got certain governmental imperatives. And I think the problem is that it has got certain powers that possibly interfere with the way in which local town councils are run, which is then where you get this friction, you see. It all works very well if the town council is a PAP town council, then they all work hand in hand. But the problem then becomes, if it is not a PAP town council, which of course we have one now, then they suddenly realize that, oh, I've got to seek permission from PA for certain things, and they are being this difficult about that. They are not approving our things and all that. And then we even had this whole
the mini fair.
Yeah, the whole mini fair that they claimed was not properly licensed and all that. Which was basically they had to get the okay from the PA, and I don't know why they needed that, but apparently it was required. And the PA said no. So they went ahead and held it, and then therefore got into trouble, and then had no license, and it became a court case. So I don't know. I mean, is it better that we have an organization or association that promotes community affairs, which is not a government department? Yeah, perhaps. Or do we just recognize that, or is it that PA, its roles are too undefined? That why should it be making decisions like signing off on town fairs in wards and things like that? Yeah, maybe that needs to be more clearly defined.
No, but what about the fact that the CC or RC chairman is not elected, but more appointed by the MP of the ward? And in the case of Aljunied or AHPTC, the chairman is not appointed by the...
Yeah, because I think they are appointed by PA.
Yeah.
So PA is a government department, they will appoint accordingly.
Yeah.
Any...
I think
the
Kirsten wants to
question
respond
on
to
the five
Debate.
leaders debate. Right? I think that would be in the right direction. Then you stumble into this whole murky thing of how much do you trust the press to moderate it in a way that asks the tough questions and is fair. Because I remember in the last election they had it as well. They had a few of these political debates, and then there were a lot of arguments that the moderator is not fair. And I think in any country, any situation, there will always be people who will say that it's like football, the referee is always not fair when your side is moving. So I think there will always be this issue, but I would hope to see more of these, to have like maybe you could have like a leaders debate of the major parties and really force them to talk about issues in detail rather than everyone comes and like talks about their slogan and then everyone goes home again.
Do we have any further questions? Maybe this will be the last one or two that we have, because we are running short. Yeah, Vanessa.
I got a very stupid question. So last time, right, WP won 6 seats, but then the whole cabinet is made up of PAP only. Why? And is there a scenario in which even if the Workers' Party doesn't, or the Alternative Party doesn't win, that they can still be a minister? So what's the relationship between the cabinet?
The answer to your question is you didn't come early to
listen
to this presentation.
Okay, so the cabinet is so what happens is the president will pick as PM the person who commands the confidence of a majority of parliament. Okay, of all elected MPs, I think. No, parliament. Yeah, I think by that at that time, let me think. Actually, it doesn't include. Actually, it's seats. It might include even.
The majority seats.
No, actually, it might include NCMPs. But anyway, so basically, they will appoint someone who commands the confidence of a majority. And in the case of what has happened in Singapore, because PAP has always had a clear majority, it will always be a PAP candidate who becomes the PM. Then it is the PM who will pick the other members of his cabinet to be ministers. There is technically nothing to stop the PM from picking an opposition member to be a minister, because the constitution doesn't bar it, right? It just says any MP can be appointed a minister. And I think that would even include an NCMP or an NMP if he wanted to. It's just that why would he? There's just no reason why he would do so. But actually, technically speaking, there's nothing to stop it.
So I guess it's like if you looked at the last UK election where they had a coalition government, then the Tory PM picked Liberal Democrat MPs to be ministers because that was part of the coalition agreement. Like, if you buck out with me, I'll make a certain number of you ministers. So that's how the Alternative Party get into cabinet. But otherwise, they would generally pick from their own party.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to add also that Speaker of Parliament doesn't even have to be an MP. The norm has been more or less that it's an MP, but actually some of in our history of Singapore, some of the speakers of parliament have actually not been MPs at all. So that's actually possible.
So I'd just like to end off with maybe one question. The big hidden, the big elephant in the room when we talk about Singapore elections is always this climate of fear. You know, there are still people who say that if I vote this way, I will kena something from the government, or if I say something, I will kena. What's your feeling, your sense as to this climate of fear? And I guess specifically to Professor Jack Lee, the other thing about elections is freedom of information, freedom to decide. We know that our media, the mainstream media, has been a bit slanted in its coverage. Well, what are the legal threats that it might face that might explain this slanted coverage, or do you think it's non-legal but more political choice by the editors? And of course, Kirsten, you are a journalist, so if you could just give your comments and views on that.
I don't know if it's legal fear, but I have heard that mainstream media sees themselves as the way I had it described to me once was that the mainstream media is pro-government regardless of who. So we are not pro-PAP, we are pro-government. It just happens that PAP is always the government. So that was how it was once explained to me, and I feel that if you go into a newsroom with that mindset, whether there are legal repercussions or not, it's like the judiciary. If you already go in with that ethos and that mindset, you don't need the gun to your head to make you look at things a certain way, process things a certain way. So I think that would be one problem. The climate of fear. Voting, I think.
Is there any way they can find out how you voted, for example?
I mean, I don't think so. Okay, so a lot of people complain that all our ballot papers have got serial numbers on them. This has been explained as a means to prevent fraud because it's then harder to kind of fake a ballot and stuff it in, because then you could say, hey, how come there are two ballot number 936s? It's very strange, right? So there's some way to trace it. If not, then it would be very hard to detect a fake ballot that's put in the box. I personally feel, I don't really have a fear that it is not secret, because I've actually just kepo a bit. I went to be a counting agent during the last presidential election to observe how the counting procedure went. And what happens is that the boxes, after they are taken from the polling station, they are sealed and they are actually taken to the counting center, and the seals are only broken in the presence of the representatives from the candidates anyway. So I think that if you saw that, hey, how come it's got like tear and then stuck a new sticker over it, it would be very quickly detected. So it looks like the process generally is quite good. Then of course, after the counting takes place, all the documents are put back into the ballot boxes, they are sealed again, and then they are taken to the Supreme Court and put in the vault. And then they are kept for a certain period in case anyone tries to challenge the outcome of the election, in which case then they can be pulled out again. So far it's not happened. And then after a certain period, if there are no objections, then they will be taken for destruction to the incinerator. And at that process again, representatives from the candidates are asked to come down and inspect that, look, they have been untouched since they were put in the vault, all the seals are intact, and we'll throw them into the fire without opening the seals. And none of the candidates have ever said, aha, I found that this box has been reopened and something has been taken out. So I mean, I think by and large, I don't really have any fear that the votes are not secret. Yeah.
I have found that it is often the older generation who are quite worried that the votes. I've never met anyone the younger generation who's worried that their vote are not secret. But I've heard a lot of young people saying that grandmothers have told them not to vote because your vote may not be secret. So I think it is really to reassure like grandparents and older Singaporeans, that your vote is secret, and just because you're a civil servant doesn't mean they know your vote and then you lose your job, or this kind of thing. I've heard a lot of these things. I remember like the most striking thing about the climate of fear that I had was in the last election. I went to cover a Workers' Party rally, and it was absolutely chock-a-block, like thousands of people streaming. Everyone was wearing blue, and just outside the stadium was this ice cream man, and his ice cream truck was like this massive Workers' Party shrine, because he had the umbrella, he had the flag, and then he had the thing wrapped around it, and he was wearing Workers' Party t-shirt, and so the whole ice cream, like you could barely see his menu because he had so many Workers' Party things stuck on it. So I was like, oh, that's really cute. So I took a photo of it, and he started screaming at me, and he said, you cannot take my photo because they will know I was here. I was like, look at your truck! Like, from far away I can also see you're here. But he was really, he was, getting into the celebratory feeling, but he was really scared that, if this went beyond that little spot that he was in and, appeared in the newspaper, they would know he was there. And he couldn't articulate, what they would do after finding out that he sold ice cream with Workers' Party flags on them, right? But he was really worried about this. He made me delete the photo.
Oh, wow. Okay, so Damien, you asked about the media.
Yeah.
I think it is also well known that the media is highly regulated in Singapore. For example, the print media, the newspapers, are regulated by the Newspaper and Printing Presses Act. And it's a very complicated act, and I won't go through the whole thing, but one provision, for example, is that the minister chooses the editor. It's stated in the act. And so, if the minister is the one who will choose whether or not the editor stays or goes, right, he can fire the editor as well. You can be sure that the minister will be giving certain directions to the editor. I suppose it depends on the minister, right? Some minister will just maybe say politely, have you thought about taking this stance and all that? And some may be sterner, I think it's both. I think the minister for this one will be under Minister of Communications and Information, gets to pick both the chairman of the board as well as the editor. Key appointment of all registered newspapers in Singapore. So I think, and this was explicit, the PAP government, when they brought in this piece of legislation, wanted to exercise this level of control over newspapers. And similarly, they have licensing powers under the Broadcasting Act to license broadcasters who deliver news, and to some lesser extent to regulate websites that provide news and so on as well. So these are ways in which control can be exerted to some extent over editorial policy. And I think we just have to, of course, you might think this is a very undesirable position and that it should be changed, and I would agree with you, but until it is changed, we just have to recognize it for what it is and read the news intelligently. You could say on the other hand that not everything that is online is necessarily reliable either, right? You've got to read that with some caution as well. So it's just a matter of being reading widely and being savvy and aware of what is available out there, and certain biases that what is written and yeah.
And now, because so many things are online, it's getting easier and easier to also go straight to the source material. So you don't have to read a Straits Times article on Workers' Party's manifesto. If you can download the actual manifesto, then read it for yourself. So it is getting easier in this way to actually track back and find the source material.